Hi, everybody, and welcome to School on Wheels workshop on working with English language learners and IEPs. Today, we're going to be joined by Lauren Reed, who's actually my sister-in-law, but also a very talented teacher. So she's taught in Arizona in some low-income areas, so has dealt with Spanish speaking students and has learned how to work with them through her master's program and through her work in those schools. And then she's also dealt with IEPs as well, so she knows what those are all about. And I know that a lot of our tutors end up working with students that are English language learners or have an IEP. So this is trying to give you a little bit more background on what those things mean. And she's going to tell you a little bit more about some strategies on how to work with those kids and make it a really good learning experience for everyone involved. So we're about to start. So if everyone can just make sure that your microphones are on mute, and please keep them on mute throughout. There is a spot for questions. If you'll notice on the little sidebar there, you can put your questions in the box, and we can have a little bit of time for questions at the end that I will ask to our presenter. Other than that, I will throw it over to Lauren to get started. So if you can introduce yourself, Lauren, and then go ahead.
Well, thank you. So like Cody said, my name is Lauren Reed. I do have my master's from Arizona State University in education, and I have been an elementary school teacher for 5 years, working in second and third grade, and also highly in the low-income areas, as well as working with English language learners. So with that, a lot of the examples I'll be showing are geared more towards the elementary school grades, but they can be used for any grade level. You just may need to tweak them a little bit if you're working with older students, especially high school. So with that, let's get started. So the presentation is mostly geared towards working with the English language learners, and then near the end, I will talk about working with students with IEPs as well. So when I first started grad school, I quickly learned that the education department loves acronyms. Almost everything is an acronym. So the ones that we're going to use mostly today are ELLs, that is English language learners. And the second most popular is ESL, English as a second language. So those are the two that you'll most likely hear. They're also referred to as ESOL, English for speakers of other languages. So even though they say English as a second language, we'd obviously recognize that English, they might very well speak multiple languages, not just two. And then again, you're at the end, we're going to speak about IEPs, which stands for Individualized Education Program. So who are English language learners? They are defined as non-native English speakers who are learning English in school. So this basically means that their home language is something other than English. They are designated by the registration paperwork almost all of the time. So when a student registers at the school, there is a box on there that asks if there is another language primarily spoken in the home other than English. And if that box is checked, then they are considered an ELL. And we'll talk about in a little bit that there's different levels of ELLs, but they are first marked as an ELL, and then there's further evaluation done after that. Now, Spanish is the primary language spoken by ELLs in the United States. I got this information, I was telling Cody, I got some of my old textbooks out from when I was in school. And as of 2008, 80% of ELLs were native Spanish speakers. Now, myself being in Arizona and you guys in California, I'm sure that's what you see as well. And ELLs come from a varied background. The student themselves could have moved here from another country very, very recently. They could have been born in the United States where their families moved from another country. They could have come seeking asylum, such as like from a war-torn country. They could have also been born in the United States and have their ancestors from the United States, such as Native American tribes. They could have lived on the reservation, but their primary language at home is something other than English. One of the biggest things and the best things that you can do when working with an English language learner is to get to know them. So understanding their background knowledge is key to offering them support in their education. So you obviously would like to know some of their basic facts, such as where they're from, how long they've lived here, what their primary language is. And those are information that you can get either from the school, from their registration paperwork, or this can come up in conversation. You obviously don't want to grill them, but especially when you're first getting to know them. But this is all very important information. And this can also help you determine kind of where they're at in their language journey. And then another huge part is their personal interests. So what are they interested in outside of school? And this really helps with their engagement and their level of interest. And it also, just getting to know them and then getting to know you is going to create that safe and secure environment. And the more they feel safe and secure, the better their learning environment is going to be. Here are some examples of all about me posters. So pretty much every teacher I know will do something like this at the beginning of the school year. So for all students, regardless of their background, if they're ELL or not. On the left is actually my son's poster that we made for preschool, but I just wanted to show that it can be very simple. Of course, I wrote this for him, and we talked about what he wanted to say though. And that's something that you could do with an ELL, especially if they struggle with expressing themselves in a writing sort of way. So you could write it for them. You ask them like, what does this mean to you? And obviously, write that down. And then on the right is an example of something if they just wanted to draw pictures. So if they're not able to write what they want to say, they can, draw a picture and talk about that with you and explain themselves a little bit. So again, this is probably the number one thing that will be beneficial for you and the student is to get to know them, understand where they came from, and increase their level of interest and engagement. So I did talk about levels. So as you can see here, this is an example of the different levels. So as you can see, in the state of California, they're referred to as the beginning is emerging, then expanding, then bridging. And if you go down to Arizona, which is where I'm from, ours is actually broken into 6 different levels: pre-emergent, emergent, basic, low intermediate, high intermediate, and then we have another level, level 6 as proficient. So these are evaluated on an annual basis, and as the student progresses, they will go into the different levels. Now this is important because you need to know what level your student is at, so what level of support to provide them. And I did include some of the descriptors for these levels. There's another slide as well that goes into levels 4 and 5. There's obviously a lot of information, but I just wanted you to be able to see like the difference between a level 1 and a level 5. Level 1 is basically understanding very simple words. So this would be a student who is pretty new to speaking English. This is actually where I would be in my Spanish. I have some memory of my high school Spanish, but very simple. For the most part, a language learner is going to be able to understand before they're able to speak it themselves. And when I was talking with some of my colleagues about this project, they made sure to remind me that they have seen a student, especially a lower level ELL student, and more in the the beginning stages, will be speaking on the playground in English with friends before they're going to speak in the classroom. So they're not going to feel as comfortable in the classroom setting. Now, if we look at the next one, levels 4 and 5, you can see level 5 is a much more complex speaker. So they're able to understand and articulate themselves in English a lot better. But so as you can see, like the levels progress. So again, it's important to know which level they're at so you can provide the correct support. And I'm going to talk about it a lot more later, but there's something that we use called scaffolding. And that's, again, like that's how much support is needed for the student. And then you also don't want to not give them enough support where they reach a frustration level, because then a lot of students will just start to shut down at that point. And then, of course, you don't want to give them not enough support. You want to push them more depending on where they're at. So then let's talk about what this is mostly about, is our strategies for working with these students. So I have examples of all of these, but the biggest ones are visuals. So visuals are very crucial into understanding language. If you think about, if you were learning a new language, you would want, to have a picture to go with the word to help you understand it better. Same thing with labeling. English language learner students, we have our classrooms labeled, everything is labeled. Talk about graphic organizers, that's a teacher's best friend. Scaffolding, working in groups, and then the different types of vocabulary, and then language itself. So there are some tricky language things that we need to be careful with. So here's an example of using visuals. So as you can see in this poster, it's very clear what the teacher is expecting of the student from the picture. And then obviously there's words to support that. So even someone who is not able to understand the language or read the language can look at the picture and understand what's expected of them. Other examples are just pictures, videos are great. Modeling, so showing the students what you would want them to do. So you could, if you were talking about proper, sitting or learning position, getting on the floor, showing them yourself, acting something out. So this brings me back to every Christmas we would read the Gingerbread Man story, and that the whole class would act this out. So we would read the story. We would go on a hunt because the gingerbread man ran away. So we'd go on an adventure through the school looking for the gingerbread man, and then coming back and there was gingerbread man cookies there. So that, for me, it actually sticks in my head because we acted it out and it was very involved, and that's going to be the same thing for the students. And then again, graphic organizers, which I believe is on the next slide because we use those all the time. So like I said, label everything. And if that's something, now I know Cody mentioned that you guys are in different locations, but if the students come to the Learning Center and there could be labels, that would be a helpful tool. As you can see, there's pictures with the words, and obviously put it next to the item as well. So that can be very helpful. So these are an example of a graphic organizer. So that's basically a way to put your thoughts on paper and kind of help organize it. This is what we call a KWL chart. So this can be used for pretty much anything. It's very, very good for reading comprehension. So and again, it kind of going back to the background knowledge. So say a student really likes basketball and you want to work on understanding what the student is reading, then we could find a story on basketball, read the story, and before they read it, we would talk about what does that student know. So what do they know about basketball? What do they know, about maybe the character in the story from the picture book? And then they can have a few things on what they would want to know. And as they're reading, you can ask more questions, because good readers think about what they're going to read. They think about the reading during the process, and then the L is what you learned after the reading. So you would answer your questions of what you wanted to know if you found that information, or anything else that you have learned from that story. So again, graphic organizers are just a good way of assisting in the reading comprehension or organizing your thoughts. And again, visualizing for the student what they're actually doing, and working them through that, what I guess we would say we do naturally, just making it more cognizant for them. Here's another favorite graphic organizer of mine. So the one that we just looked at, that KWL chart, as well as this is called the Freyer model. But as you can see, this is something you could easily do without having it prepared. So if you're working with a student, and I would assume you're doing what the student has been assigned from school possibly. So if you were, say, reading a story and you wanted to do the KWL chart, blank piece of paper, fold it in three sections and write KWL. Same thing with this. You can fold the paper into 4 sections and then fold that one corner down so you get the square in the middle. And you just, this could be your vocabulary word. So we're going to talk about vocabulary in a minute, but vocabulary is one of the biggest things for any student, but especially ELLs. And I'll talk about why, but basically building their vocabulary is going to help them with reading comprehension and help them in their language development. So it's very important for them to understand that. So, but as you can see, we would put our word in the middle, and then definition, you could either have them write it in their own words or give them the definition, depending on where they're at. They can draw pictures, examples. So those are kind of like synonyms and non-examples. And you could also make these 4 boxes anything that you thought would be necessary or helpful for the student to understand the word. But again, I just really like that one because you can do it on the fly. You don't need any preparation. And it's just a helpful way for them to understand that. And I'm sure you guys are all familiar with this, but I also love a good Venn diagram for comparing and contrasting. And again, it's just a visual way for the student to understand and to see like what's going on in their head, but putting it on paper so it's clear for them, you know, what they're looking at, what they're comparing and contrasting. So on the left is just a blank Venn diagram you could use for anything, and I thought the one on the right was cute because it's obviously pumpkins and apples. And these are all different story maps. So these are really good for reading comprehension as well. And again, based on where the student is, they could complete this on their own. You could read the story to them or have them read the story and then go through first, next, then last. You guys could talk about it. They could write it, you could write it, whatever it is that what kind of support they need. But these are really good ways for them to visualize on paper, again, what should be going on in their head when they're reading. The bubble map, it can be good for reading or writing. You could put your main idea in the middle, and then details could be each of the bubbles to help them start their writing process. And then getting to know our character for reading as well. And I really like the text evidence. So that's a big thing in education lately, has been answering a question, but then finding in the text where you got your information. So supporting that with evidence from the text. And any of these graphic organizers, you could Google any of these and get them for free. There's some on Pinterest. Teacher Pay Teachers actually has a bunch of free stuff as well. And so here's the word I've been using a lot called scaffolding. So if you picture a construction site, especially in like New York City, that kind of stuff, there's the scaffolding that they use to support the building as they're building it. And then as the building gets its own support, the scaffolding is removed. That's the same thing that we do with our students. So again, understanding their background knowledge and where their level is very important to know how much or how little support they need to be successful. So then when pre-teaching vocabulary, that is also extremely important for understanding the text. So again, if you are working with a student and they either have a book or they have like a short excerpt that they're reading that they want to practice, if you could quickly scan that, maybe pick out 3 to 5 words that they may not truly understand or that are important to understanding the text, and you could pre-teach that with them before reading it. You can use like those Freyer model examples or any of the organizers, or simply just writing the word, drawing a picture. But understanding the vocabulary, again, will increase the number of words that they understand from a language point of view, but also from understanding the story or the excerpt that they're reading. And so reading aloud, again, with their levels, if the student is not at a point in their education where they are able to read it themselves, read it out loud. They can follow along. And in fact, if they're a struggling reader, it's better to read it aloud first so they can listen to it and understand it in their head versus struggling on each word, because the comprehension won't be there if they're struggling to read the words. But then again, if their level is higher, then maybe they could read it a little loud and you can just follow along and support them and help out where they're struggling, and use those good old graphic organizers. And then sentence frames are something that I really, really like, and that's great for scaffolding. So you can start with basically writing out a sentence and taking out maybe 2 or 3 words for the student to fill in the blank. That's a great start. And then as the student progresses, you could use sentence starters. So basically just give them the beginning of the sentence, like, in this story, I learned, and then they can complete that. And then they will be able to write sentences on their own. So you want to model what a complete sentence looks like, maybe like where from the story you can find your information to complete the sentence, that kind of stuff. And we'll talk about group work in a moment, but group work is really important for scaffolding as well. Teachers, we look at things usually from like a I do, we do, you do. So the teacher does it first by modeling, then we can all do it together to practice, and then the student would do it on their own individually. So you could do that as well. From a tutoring point of view, I'm not sure if group work is available or not, but even like 1 or 2 extra students would be helpful. And then of course you can see from the picture how scaffolding can make a difference. So on the left, everyone is given the same thing, but it's not what they need. And on the right, the equity shows a picture of giving the student what they need to get them to the same level. And I mentioned the cooperative learning groups. So this is, again, if you get the chance to use group work, this is really helpful, because having peer help can be, especially for a language development point of view, peers can actually be more beneficial than an adult sometimes. But we use purposeful arrangement. So typically, if there was an ELL student, we would want to make sure to pair them with a strong speaker so they can have, again, that modeling and something to, I guess, look up to. And then maybe 2 other students who might just be more in the average category. And then if we assign group roles in the group work, that is also extremely helpful. And if you have your group that you created on purpose, you can also assign your group roles on purpose. So the reader role, you'll probably want to give to the stronger reader of the group, because you don't want to make the student frustrated or feel bad if they're not able to complete something. And you want the reader to model what a reading should be sounding like, especially from their age level. And then a scribe, so the person to like be in charge of writing, the speaker, and then you could have someone that checks the work. So again, knowing your students and their background is helpful with that. And then a strategy I really like is called jigsaw. But basically, if you have a few students that you can break up some reading, maybe give a paragraph to each student, they read it, come back together, and then discuss what they read. So it's like they get that ownership of that information, so the student is able to really comprehend that section of the information, share it with their other students, and, you know, believe it or not, they like to hear stuff from children sometimes and not from authority figures, because hearing the same person's voice over and over again, apparently they can tune that out. And then let's talk about vocabulary. So this is some information as I was reading through my textbook again that I found very interesting. So I guess there's 2,000 words on a high frequency word list. And those can be Googled, but there's roughly the same words, especially the first 1,000 or so. But those are words that account for 84% of conversation and 73% of academic text. So, and as you can see as you read on, these words can be acquired through just, regular conversation, incidental learning, and explicit instruction. So whenever you would go think back to like your reading, if you're pre-teaching that vocabulary, that would be considered explicit instruction versus just maybe like a normal conversation would be incidental learning. And native English speakers, so that would be someone like me who was born in the United States. My parents spoke English in the home, so I'm a native English speaker. I acquire roughly 1,000 words per year growing up. So that would equate to more or less 18,000 words by the time I graduated high school. Here is where the discrepancy comes in and why English language learners as well as lower socioeconomic children struggle or can struggle in school. So lower socioeconomic students acquire about half of those as a higher socioeconomic student. And that's huge. So if you think about by the time we got to high school, and if I learned 18,000 words and maybe someone next to me who didn't have the same opportunities was only learning 9,000 words. So that is huge as far as language development, comprehension, that kind of stuff. So again, this is why it is so important that we teach the vocabulary. Exposure to the language is crucial. So if I mentioned earlier about English being not the primary language in the home, so a lot of times these students, the only exposure or the most exposure they will get to the English language is in a school setting, or if they're working with people like you. So that's why, again, what you guys are doing is so incredibly awesome, is because that is providing extra support to these students who may not be getting the extra language support at home. I've seen examples of this and working with lower income students. I remember very clearly is actually the librarian at my school. She's a great person. She said to me one day, I did not know when I was raising my kids that I should be working on school stuff at home. She said, I feel terrible. I just did not know that that's what I was supposed to be doing. So different cultures, different family backgrounds, all these different things affect these students. So her just really not working with her students, her kids at home, again, she didn't know it, but she felt bad. And now, so like if the students aren't receiving this at home as well, it's going to be more of a struggle for them. And some of these students aren't having any English exposure outside of school. And that brings us into academic vocabulary, which those are words, as you can see in this picture, very specific to the subject area. Now, these are words that do need to be taught through explicit instruction, because through general conversation, you're not going to be using the word equation or standard form, addend, any of that kind of stuff. So, and those are all math specific, but there's, science especially, there's words that do need to be taught explicitly for the subject to understand the content. So again, those need to be pre-taught. Using graphic organizers could be great. And if there's a place that you guys could put like some of these important words on like a word wall, we love to use word walls as teachers as well. And then of course, having that visual picture to go with it would be very helpful. And then with language, these are the trickiest. So metaphors, idioms, and sarcasm. So I had to put in, I can't pass up a Star Wars pun, so I thought that was pretty funny. But these are things that can be specific to language. So every language has their own sayings per se, and they don't typically translate to another language and make any sense. So these are some really good examples. Metaphors are saying it is something. So it's raining cats and dogs. And of course, to someone who's learning the language, that's really weird. Why would animals be falling from the sky? So if you catch any of these in reading that you're working with the students, or if you happen to say one yourself and you catch it, go ahead and explain it to them without them having to ask, because I can only see what's going on in their heads is just trying to understand what you're talking about. again, like sarcasm, any of that kind of stuff. So this is stuff that doesn't really translate into language. So and in fact, a lot of teachers, we will have an idiom of the week. And so basically that idiom is like a saying that is common to our language. So kind of practice that each week, understand what it means if they hear somebody say that. And that is wrapping up our ELLs. And then I was going to talk briefly about IEPs. So I am not a special education teacher. I was just in the general classroom. But an IEP is for any student who needs extra support services. And there's lots of different reasons. I just included a few examples here. It could be learning or physical disability, any kind of impairment, or even emotional or any cognitive challenges. So these are for students, they can receive these services in the general classroom. So I've had the special education teacher come into the classroom, sit next to the student, and give them whatever services they need to be provided. They can be taken out to a separate resource room, or they can be provided both. So the IEP process, basically, just so you guys kind of know some background, is lengthy in my experience. But so as a classroom teacher, if I saw someone who I thought might be struggling for whatever reason, I would refer them to our school psychologist, and they would start an evaluation process. And then we would work with the classroom teacher, the school psychologist, the special education teacher, and the parent and the student. So that's considered the IEP team. And sometimes there will be other people involved, such as like occupational therapist if they're having maybe trouble writing or sitting properly, language, speech therapist, whatever is needed. So they can all be considered part of the team. And again, in my experience, the process of actually getting them from, oh, I think the student might need to be evaluated, to either saying they don't need anything, they don't need any services, or they do, and writing an IEP is lengthy. I've seen it take, unfortunately, most of a school year. Now, the bad part about that is if a student moves schools, which is common in the types of situations that the students you guys are working with in a transitional housing, group homes, that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, if they are in the process, that typically will not follow them to the next school. So if they do have an actual IEP, that paperwork will go with them to the next school, and they can receive those services immediately when they start the new school. So a lot of kids fall through the cracks because of this, especially if they're not provided a stable home life. Then if they're moving schools a lot, it's terribly sad, but it is very common where the teacher will recognize that a student is in need of services, and then they will change schools before that can be provided for them. But if you do have a student who has an IEP, and if you do have access to that, I believe Cody said that you guys are able to see their IEPs. The goals and the requirements of those are typically very, very specific. So they're actually rather easy to follow. Whatever is on the IEP is actually legally obligated that the student receives that. And it is also what they are able to use on standardized testing. So unfortunately, standardized testing is a big part of education, whether we like it or not, but that's how students and teachers are evaluated each year. So most students with an IEP will have accommodations that they are allowed to use on their testing. So example, if, and this also goes for ELLs, by the way. So ELL, especially depending on their level, they will have different accommodations that they're allowed to have. And if you're able to get that information, that is very helpful because you could practice that with them. So a lot of my ELL students, especially in the lower levels, they were able to have me read them a question. Now, the trick to that is they would have to raise their hand and explicitly ask me to read them a question during the test. And good or bad, a lot of students choose not to do that. So if that's something that they're allowed to have, then that would be an awesome thing to practice with them so they can get in the habit. If they're not, if they don't understand it or just whatever, they can raise their hand and have you read it to them, or whatever their accommodations are. If you could practice with them, that would be a very big help to the student. Let's see what else you said. Yeah, so again, the falling through the cracks thing is probably the most frustrating thing about IEPs, because there are a lot of students that are in need and they are not able to receive the services that they need because of their transitioning between schools and homes. But if you see a need with a student, I would suggest voicing that as soon as possible. And even if they're in switching schools, then hopefully we could contact someone and get them the help that they need. Because as I'm sure you've seen and you guys have learned already, that being a student and a child is hard enough, and then given all of these extra things that these students are dealing with, a possible not stable home, switching schools, switching homes, maybe not having parents that are around, learning a different language on top of learning everything else. These are all very difficult on children. So anything that you could do, obviously, to relieve that would be very helpful. But I believe that is actually all I have. And before I switch it back over to Cody for questions and stuff, I just wanted to thank Cody very much for including me on this. And I wanted to give a sincere thank you to all of you guys for working with these students, because we all see firsthand how difficult it can be for them. And any kind of stable interaction they can have, especially with regards to education, is extremely helpful for them. So thank you guys for everything that you are doing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lauren. I appreciate you coming out to do this for us, because we always like to have a teacher, especially that knows a little bit more about the ins and outs of what our tutors are having to deal with, who are not professional teachers, or a lot of them are not education professionals. So we really appreciate that. We do have a couple questions for you here. One question we got was, let me see here how I'm going to phrase this, because it's asked towards me. Can you name those websites again where you can find those free handouts? So you mentioned a couple education websites that might help out our tutors to find some materials.
Yes, in fact, if I'm able to edit this slides, I will add them on there. But honestly, you can Google them. And if you go to the images, there's lots of different options.
Mm-hmm.
But Pinterest is an app that I like to use.
Sure.
If you're not familiar with it, it's amazing for recipes as well. And then Teacher Pay Teachers is a really great website. You do have to create a login and password. And there are some things on there that you have to pay for, but you can click on a free section. And there is lots and lots of those kind of graphic organizers. But again, that was Teachers Pay Teachers. And the reason that it's called that is that most of these are things created by teachers, and then they are just selling them to other teachers.
Okay, great. Another question we got was, how are students affected in other subjects that might be having trouble learning English? So how does that kind of impact them in, say, the math and the sciences? Do you have any idea there?
Yes, so I would say most of the strategies I did gear more towards the reading, but those are also just as crucial in math and science, social studies. So the vocabulary is probably the number one thing to focus on, and then backing that up with visuals. So math and science both understand, because that's the academic vocabulary that they're not going to hear in a conversation with somebody else. So pre-teaching that and backing it up with any kind of visual and any hands-on, especially with math and science. We'll use manipulatives a lot with math, which are just basically anything that they can manipulate or hold in their hand.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, great. And then I also noticed, so one of our attendees asked about earlier, I think you mentioned right at the beginning about kind of finding out where the student was from, what country they were from or how long they've been in the U.S. or anything like that. And so she's asking how does that determine what kind of support they need, or what was the purpose, I guess, of finding that out? How did that help with this situation?
Well, I guess for example, if you have a student who, say, moved here maybe a few weeks ago, a month ago,
Mm-hmm.
directly from Mexico and has no background in English,
Mm-hmm.
versus a student who was born here but his parents speak English and he might even be a translator for them because
Mm-hmm.
that's very common. The first student who just recently moved here with no background is most likely going to be scared.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to feel vulnerable, not comfortable, because if you could picture yourself the opposite, maybe like myself, I don't know Spanish that well, but I know a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
If I were to go to Mexico, I would feel completely overwhelmed. I would understand maybe every 10th word that was being said. So with that situation, if there is somebody, especially from the tutoring side, if there was somebody that maybe spoke Spanish or spoke that student's language, whether it be an adult or a peer, so in the classroom setting, if that student who just moved here did not speak the language, I would try to pair them up with a student who did. And we would want to focus on speaking English primarily, but
Mm-hmm.
that is also going to help the student with just the basics. So, he could ask the student in their own language, where do I go to the bathroom? Where, how do I eat lunch? And they're just going to feel a lot safer and like that someone's kind of, I guess, there for them more
Oh, okay,
versus,
gotcha.
yeah, yeah.
Perfect. And then we did get a tip from one of my coworkers here. Did say that if you're going to look up for worksheets, everybody, if you're going to look up worksheets on Google, if you add PDF into the search term, that kind of helps find printable stuff really easily. But we did have another question here. Let me see, from one of our participants. It says, so she's in a group tutoring situation. The other students are not interested in joining the teaching session with my Japanese language learner, even when I bring snacks for participants. Um, is there any suggestions you might have to get the other students to kind of help out and kind of participate in kind of group activities with that student and kind of help them become more included, I guess?
So there's a Japanese student who's
Mm-hmm.
English language learner, and then are the other students native speakers?
It sounds that way from the
Okay.
question that's being asked. Yes.
I would, I guess my thoughts would be, depending on the age and stuff, especially though, is find maybe some common ground
Mm-hmm.
that they're all interested in and use that kind of subject area. If the true, I guess if you could maybe make it fun, do a game that's not education related at all at first and kind of like icebreaker type deal, and then go from there and see if we get some interest levels. But I do like
Okay.
the bribing as well.
Right. Right. And she did mention they are middle schoolers, so the toughest group of
Okay.
kids to get to do anything, I'm sure. But
Correct. Yes.
I think those are some great suggestions there on how to get them involved, and that's always a tough situation in any group tutoring, whether they're native speakers or not. But again, I would like to thank you, Lauren. It looks like that's all the questions we've got. I
Awesome.
just want to remind all of our listeners that we will be posting this in our workshop library this week. So if you didn't hear the whole presentation, if you came in late, you can always check that out. Or if you just want to see the presentation again, you'll have that available to you through our workshop library. Other than that, Lauren, I very much appreciate you coming out and helping us out. And I hope our tutors have learned a good deal to work with students with IEPs and English language learners today.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
All right.
Bye.